Safe Space Cafe. News, music, and comedy.
Don't want to see get put NDP and the Bloc clearly are demonstrating that they want to be part of
and make their representations.
Well, it just, I think it was the old, the great Rabbi Hillel said, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And there's these people who we're told are so worried about this bill, but they're not speaking up. I think we had one or two witnesses with concerns. The rest were in favor of it. My office made a point, in the interest of balance, to send an invitation or ask that the clerk invite the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council. I understand they didn't even bother to accept our invitation. And presumably they represent the employer. There's another organization, I think it was called FedCo, which is responsible for federally regulated employers. Did I miss it? Did we hear a peep from them? I don't think we did. So if all the plan sponsors are so worried about this bill, I don't know why they didn't come and say so. Because right now, if we're just relying on the evidence presented in the committee, the testimony was overwhelmingly in the other direction. So, and I appreciate you've come here with a lot of very intelligent insights into both the statute, the bill, and if I could add a third, the technical consequences of passing it. Frankly, you're the only one doing that, and I suppose that's a compliment. But the industry has been asleep at the switch. So on that point, the argument that some people have made in the past against this bill and this idea is that it would raise the cost of capital. Businesses would have a harder time raising loans if lenders knew that they would be knocked down the bankruptcy liquidation food chain. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to say that I find that to be a strength of the bill, because it would force CEOs in the present day to ensure their pension is properly funded in order to be able to go to the markets. If lenders were consistently telling the CFO and the CEO, well, we're not going to lend to you because we're worried that we're going to be behind a pension liability, well, that'd be a wonderful incentive to get the executives to eliminate that liability by ensuring they've put enough funds into the pension entity. What do you say to that?
I think a lot depends on the relative market prospects, the operational considerations of the entity in question, and then the time duration. One of our considerations is, sure, in kind of pure market theory, I think one would imagine that the only chance for me to get 100% paid was if the pension was 100% funded, I will press for the pension to be 100% funded so that I get 100% paid. The alternative, though, is if I believe that there's a mechanism by which I could potentially get 100% paid through some other means, I might pursue it. Notably, if I know that you have a large unfunded pension liability, I may make a couple of other choices. One is I may charge you a lot for that capital, which may force you into a liquidation because you actually may not be able to access it at that price. The second is I might try and be the first, and this is what one of the principles of our insolvency system is. We have what we coin a prevention against the race to the courthouse, and that's why we make all of the creditors come together, line up, figure out exactly where they fit and how they go, and then we treat them class by class in that consideration. One of the fears is that actually you might incentivize not a race to the courthouse, but a race to call your loan. In that, if you actually had an existing liability with the entity, if you thought that you could go first before your competitors do, if you know that they had other secured lenders, but that you could potentially get your piece of the pie back before they actually went insolvent, you would do that and you'd potentially try and get paid, but that would just force the entity into liquidation sooner and then potentially prevent that restructuring that we were hoping for. So while in theory, I think there is some notion that this could put pressure, The other is potentially we need to look at time frame and amount. So as we noted, the pension regulations vary enormously jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and so in some cases that pension liability is going to be made up. But what's the time frame in which you're going to put pressure on me to make it back? Because I can only really make it back to the degree to which I either have sufficient excess working capital that I can defer to my pension obligations rather than my working capital, or I've got market returns that potentially need to somehow generate that mix. One potential unintended consequences of that pressure is I actually pursue a much riskier investment scheme with those pension funds to be able to make back that portion, because your pressure on me to say, Mark, you need to be 100% funded in 2 years or I'm calling my loan, is suddenly I'm like, oh man, I need to make up that gap. And so I race out and put myself in very risky investments that potentially may or may not pay off, but ultimately will lead to the outcome you are seeking as my creditor. And so I think we'd have to consider a number of these factors when we look at whether or not it will actually apply pressure from lenders towards the good outcome of a fully funded pension, or whether or not we actually will see unintended consequences like early liquidations, races to calling loans, and potentially riskier mechanisms or stewardship of pension funds by plan sponsors to be able to meet the requirements of their lenders.
Right, but I guess what I have a hard time believing that it would be in the interest of management to throw away pension funds on extremely risky lottery type investments. That would more likely reduce the overall value of the pension fund and make it harder still to raise money under this bill. So I think what it would actually do is force management to get the pensions in order now, because if you're lenders, if you're a CEO and your lenders are all telling you, listen, the big obstacle to lending to you is that you don't properly fund your pension plan. Well, the first thing you're going to do is try to find a way to fund your pension plan because it's in your interest, or else you can't borrow. And then your shareholders are going to say, "Why, Mr. CEO, why can't you borrow any money? Why won't anybody lend to you?" And then you'll have to say to them, "Well, it's because I didn't fund my pension plan," and that comes first in a liquidation. And so that's the incentive that I think that this bill creates. And
I guess that depends on whether or not we think
incentive.
that lenders are going to be that singular. Because one of the things is that if I'm a lender, I'm actually going to look at your full P&L. And I'm going to say, yes, you've got an unfunded pension liability. That makes me scared because I might not get paid. But if you're going to divert working capital, that's actually the means by which you earn profit to go and fund your pension liability, I'm also not going to love you and be super interested in funding you, because now actually the means by which you earn, which is ultimately the mechanism that I'm going to get paid after you paid that pension liability, is also now in jeopardy. And so you'd want a balanced approach from the entity. And so
right, but what you're really saying though, Mr. Sean, is that absent this bill, then that the business would invest in working capital instead of investing in the solvency of the pension fund.
It depends, I guess, on two things. One is the degree to which there is actually excess capital, and so that very much is fact specific depending on the company. And the second is their pension regulations. We don't give them that luxury in federally regulated pension plans. They have to be 100% funded, and then they make special payments over the subsequent 5 years to make up that gap. That's not the case in all regulated pensions. And so if I know that I only have to be at 85% funded on a solvency basis, that 15%, that I can play with. I can make decisions about that. We don't give that luxury. We don't think that that's something that's dispensable in a federally regulated context, but that's not necessarily the case. But if you actually see some of the companies,
the 85% rule, is that exists in certain provinces? Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
I don't want them to have 15% of the pension fund as play money. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
And what I'm saying is, I think that the strongest way to do that, well, in my consideration, I think one of the things we need to look at is the degree to which pension obligations are actually requiring of that, rather than trying to fix it in insolvency. To go back to our kind of one of my initial comments, fixing a policy problem at the tail end is very much it's much harder than trying to fix it at the front end when you actually.
I know, and then I guess what I'm saying, and I guess we'll have to disagree on this, is I think that this bill would actually force them to fix it on the front end, because it would require they get the money in place as soon as they go to bond markets, if you're doing a bond issuance and you're a CEO, all these extremely sophisticated analysts are going to tear apart your balance sheet, and they're going to say, you know, on the liability side, there's this pension thing, and they're only 84% funded in the pension thing, or 85%. And they're getting away with it because they're in this province that allows it. But I, as a bondholder, would have to come behind that liability. So I'm going to make it known that I'm not bidding on these bonds because their pension is not properly funded. And the CEO then is going to be in a present day position where he has to get the pension in order if he wants to raise money and grow the company. And I think that's actually a positive market discipline to impose on CEOs that are promising pensions to workers and deferring their wages into those pension funds. It's not a bad thing that the CEO is put in that position. It's a good thing. So that's the first point I guess I would make. The next point I would make is why you continue to raise the concern that if companies had to properly fund their pension funds before paying out other creditors in the case of a bankruptcy, that they would be inclined to go bankrupt or fall into insolvency. What if we gave them 3 years for the coming into force of this bill, so that they could use that time to get their act together and replenish their pension funds, eliminate liabilities, and present a positive balance sheet to markets when they raise money?
So right now, I'll offer a couple of kind of just considerations to that without weighing in one way or the other. Just to say, on our federal regulated pension obligations right now make special payments over 5 years. That's what we see as a reasonable planning window to allow people to make back up their current deficit, because oftentimes that deficit's not a function necessarily of their own making. It's potentially market returns. It's a number of kind of factors. So 3 years. And I believe there was a proposal at some point to potentially make special payments in a certain province only 3 years, and there was pushback to the degree to which 3 years was potentially seen as insufficient. The second is there's nothing in a restructuring context right now that actually prevents from that potentially happening with the consent of the pension regulator and the workers union. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the case of Air Canada, which was an agreement in the restructuring to forego pension payments for a period of time to allow for the company to get back on its footing post the financial crisis and the complete decimation of air travel. And that ultimately led towards a restructured entity that came back.
My apologies, Mr. Sean. I don't want to interrupt you or you, MP Poilievre. I'm receiving a note from the clerk that there is a hard stop at 1 o'clock because of a lack of translation services. So.
I'll be very short. A number of us on here were former members of ACTRA, and they're heavily lobbyists, of course. But I bring that up because.
Le règlement, Monsieur le Président, on n'a pas la caméra de Monsieur Waugh. On ne voit.
Point of order. We don't see the lovely face of the speaker. We don't have a camera on him.
Mr. Waugh, I totally apologize. FaceTime, right?
Now you just made everyone happy. Go ahead.
That's right. Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shampoo, for pointing that out. So I will say that a number of us on here were probably members of ACTRA at one time. Whether you had a cooking show or whether you were on CTV or wherever, but we didn't know what ACTRA did. And they were a heavy lobbyist group to the government. Many of their interventions to the CRTC as employees paying dues to ACTRA, we never knew what was going on. And we still don't to this day. And that's wrong, because when you do pay dues, you always find out maybe a year later, but you never find out when they do make an interjection on the behalf of the members. And so I think Mr. Shields was right, and Mr. Reyes, that at times you find out something, but it's always after the fact. So, and I just wanted to bring that up. And Mr. Ripley, you've done a very good job here this morning explaining, the YouTube thing, because there's many, I think, out there in listening today that would say the CRTC makes too many small decisions for getting a legal opinion to be practical. And you talked about that. And there are those decisions in the online sphere that could not be taken lightly at all. We see today in free speech, and we don't want them to be able to quickly make hundreds of algorithm changes every day without proactively checking for charter compliance. So, I make that point because, we're going to go after YouTube here and others. But Mr. Ripley, I'll just, if you can explain a little bit about it. I think you've done a very good job here this morning explaining parts of this, but I think when you look at YouTube and a single user taking on ACTRA and CDCE and other organizations, you can see where the concern is, because a single user that needs maybe clarification going up against these other organizations, well, I mean, there's an imbalance there right away. We would know that. But do you just want to comment a little bit on that? I know you've explained it pretty well, but is there anything else you want to add, Mr. Ripley?
Mr. Ripley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Waugh. I might make a couple introductory points, and then actually I might suggest my colleague, Mr. Olson, jump in, who's very well versed in CRTC processes. So Bill C-10 certainly, envisions a transparent process when it comes to questions of regulations or orders, and the intention is certainly that anybody who wants to participate in those proceedings, that they have an opportunity to do so. And so, Mr. Chair, if you permit me, perhaps Mr. Olson can just quickly jump in and explain kind of how this would work in a typical CRTC process, and the kinds of things that would be naturally published on the CRTC's website, and the materials that would be made available.
Mr. Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when the CRTC initiates a public proceeding, it publishes a notice of that proceeding on its website, and in most cases in the Canada Gazette. And then it calls for comments. It has rules of procedure around the time periods and the process by which it gets those comments. Sometimes there's even a reply period that the Commission would give interveners a chance to reply to other comments. Sometimes there isn't, but that's governed in the sort of CRTC's rules of procedure. And then, so the CRTC then takes all of those submissions, and it considers only that information that's on the public record, of course, subject to any information that was filed in confidence, and then it makes its decision. And anything that's filed in confidence, the rules say there must be an abridged version without the confidential information filed. So that's usually just financial information. It's usually just numbers that get that get blanked out. But all of that information is available to all the parties other than the actual numbers. And then the Commission takes all that and makes its decision. The decision is always published on its website, and the decision is almost always published in the Canada Gazette as well. So the CRTC, runs a number of transparent, it takes transparency very seriously in that regard, and it is an administrative tribunal, and so if it has failed to follow any kind of due process, then that would be subject to judicial review.
I have one more question to Mr. Olson, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, sir.
So, in the conventional broadcasting, you'll hear an ad run by the radio station or a TV station, saying, submit, if you have issues with the station, please submit here to the CRTC Ottawa So how would that work in social media here? So, I do have the ad. I know when their license is coming up because well in advance, the station does a 30-second ad. But there are no ads here, or will there be ads on social media? Explain this process to me, because conventional TV, they do a pretty good job when their license is coming up. And if you have issues, they do direct you to the CRTC.
Mr. Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Mr. Waugh. So those commercials that you referred to are commercials that are part of the license renewal process and are an obligation that the CRTC imposes on licensees to make public the notion that the license is being renewed and that people can make comments on the conditions of license. The situation, of course, in Bill C-10 is that the proposal is to move away from a conditions of license model and towards a conditions of service model. And so the CRTC, in the clause that this committee is currently debating, clause 7 of the bill, which would include section 9.1, it does give the CRTC the powers to make orders with respect to conditions of service that would need to be put on. And so the CRTC would, under the sort of umbrella, the chapeau, if you like, of section 9.1, would have the ability, if it chooses to make requirements related to related to CRTC proceedings, like advertisements of various CRTC proceedings, if it chose to do so. That, of course, also depends on what this committee ultimately and this Parliament ultimately decides to do on whether or not conditions of service will be sort of automatically renewed, not automatically renewed, have a 7-year maximum duration, or whether or not those will be subject to different periods of review. But I would think that the Bill C-10 does give the CRTC the power to require at any time that significant conditions of service are being looked at by the Commission, to require that messages be broadcast by licensees to that effect.
Mr. Olson, that is the concern I have with the 7 years service, as you know, because every conventional TV radio station in this country starts advertising.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Ms. DeBruzen.
So I kind of let it go for a while because we were talking about legal opinions in the broader context, but now we're talking about conditions of license, and I believe that the amendment we're looking at is about independent legal opinions for all, basically all decisions from the CRTC. I'm not paraphrasing it, but there you go. So perhaps if the questions in the conversation can focus on that amendment, that would be good.
Okay. Mr. Waugh, yep, go ahead. I'm assuming that your arch, as wide swinging as it can be at some point, will come back to the center. So you still have the floor, sir. Go ahead.
No, thank you, Mr. Sims, and thank you to MP DeBruzen for the reminder. I appreciate that.
Don't forget to like, dislike, subscribe, and comment. Safe Space Cafe. And always have a good